serve back and help the river estuary and community. So thank you so much for being part of this. We're very excited about Aaron Mair sharing with us some experiences that he has had at COP28, and we'll talk about that in a minute. Yeah, if you can give me the next slide, please. Some of the guidelines to help make this go smoothly so that we all get the most from it. If you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat and tell us where you're calling from. It'd be great to know everybody who's attending. If you will, please stay on mute during the presentation so we don't have any background noise interfering with the discussion. There will be a question and answer session at the end. To ask a question, please use the Q&A. And to find that, if you need to on the bottom, you may need to go to your more question, or you may see it along the bottom, but you're looking for your Q&A because that's where we're going to get the questions from. And that'll be very helpful if you do that. And we'll bring those questions up at the end. Be aware if your camera is on or off. And so you're more than welcome to share who you are, but be aware in case you have anything you don't want to be part of the conversation, obviously. And if you have any technical difficulties, please contact Meg or Chelsea in the chat located under more, and they will see if they can help you. So we have a few people helping us with the logistics on this. Next slide, please. All right. And as I said, we are very fortunate. One of our Clearwater board members, Aaron Mair, was able to attend COP28 in Dubai back in December. Aaron is the director of the Forever Adirondacks program of the Adirondack Council, as a member of our board of directors, as I mentioned. Aaron is also an environmental justice pioneer, intersectionally working in the spaces of health, environment, voting rights, disparities over the last 40 years. A 35-year veteran of urban environmental activist, regional and national environmental justice organizer and strategist from the state of New York, and he's current national board of directors of the Sierra Club. Aaron, welcome, and we're all very excited to hear what you have to share with us.
Well, thank you, David, and it's indeed an honor to be here. Again, welcome to my conversation, or the ask was about my reflections on COP28, in which I go for reflection and a call to action. So again, I want to thank you for being here. Well, real quickly, before I roll into talk, what's COP, or Council of Parties? This year, the UN COP was held, as David mentioned, in Dubai. And what does COP stand for? COP stands for Council of Parties, which is a generic phrase in international relations speak, meaning, a committee created after an international treaty is signed, and therefore tasked with making decisions and actions on how that treaty is to be implemented. There are all kinds of COPs from the UN for various international agreements and treaties, from chemicals and weapons to containing desertification. But the term COP has come to be associated, with the meaning of one particular COP, and that was created after the signing of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, or the UNFCCC. There are 154 signatories to the UNFCCC since starting in June 1992. And that agreement is to combat the harmful human impacts of climate change. Since the COP meetings have been held almost annually, to discuss exactly in the framework how that action should be achieved and what the targets are. I think that, being part of the conversation, and again, who participates, again, governments, NGOs, corporations, everybody that's part of our current civil society participates, but the actual signatories drive the conversation. And it has been my on and off participation over the past 20 years of COPs. So it's about, I've been to about 17 COPs over the past 20 years, but clearly the most significant one in Paris was a huge, huge milestone. I always, since this is Black History Month, and it's also a point, and when we talk about reflections of frontline communities, and I think that no leader exemplifies that more than the life of Martin Luther King Jr. And again, his thesis on the inescapable mutuality that ties us all together. And he says, in short, in a real sense, all life is interrelated, all people caught in an inescapable network of mutuality tied to a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And I can never be what I ought to be until you are what you ought to be, and you can never be what you ought to be until I am what I ought to be. And this is the interrelated structure of reality. And John Muir, who is one of my environmental spiritual guides, said the same thing. We talk about parallel syllogisms where great minds think alike. Said that when we try to pick at anything by itself, we find that it's hitched to everything else in the universe. And these two great thoughts and great minds, from a front line as well to a majority line, but centering on everything from humans connected to one another in the environment and to those within the environment and the environment in general. This speaks very well and powerfully to the moment that we have at this point in human history, whereby we are all tied to this planet, and our destiny is one. And what we do at this point in time is going to be very, very critical. And we cannot act as if one action in one area will harm nobody and that there's no impacts. There, in this case, I think the thesis holds that there are no free riders, and that we must all be stewards of this planet and we must all actively engage. And what we fail to do will not only impact all of us, but there's another COP on biodiversity. It also impacts flora and fauna. So not only are we worried about our extinction, we're also worried about the extinction of other species that are tied to that web of life and tied to the web of creation, and all that we should be mindful. A little bit about me, as mentioned earlier, I'm the for Adirondack's Wilderness Campaign Director. I chose this career path immediately after retiring as an epidemiological spatial analyst. I know it's a big title from the New York State Department of Health. And I, Dr. Mair, could have gone and did some healthcare consultancy or engaged in making a bottom line. But what was most important to me as an environmental justice pioneer and activist and leader was that of caring about our planet, but caring about humanity. And the most important thing that I could ever do or could do at this critical decision making is not worry about another dime or dollar, but how can I protect our species? How can I protect this planet? And so my calling leaned toward fully throwing myself into the path of climate activism and saving the planet. Why the Adirondacks of all places? Well, wilderness is one of the greatest carbon sinks that we have. They are the thing that, next to phytoplankton, that basically provide the oxygen that we believe. And people don't realize, between the oceans and the forests, this is what gives us our breathable oxygen. And working in the Adirondacks was a logical choice versus anywhere else, because as the Adirondacks, which you may not know about, not about the Adirondacks, they are the largest wilderness carbon sink in the lower 48 states, what I call the lungs of our nation. And so they are our nation's biggest gift, and it's under threat by a lot of the very practices that allows us to burn fossil fuels, corporate greed. And so we now are trying to protect the space from climate migration, because, again, the wealthy are going to be the first to migrate and the first to move. And so they want to buy up the green spaces and the green patches for themselves at the expense of us. So your stewardship and your activism, and my stewardship and activism, is much more urgent now than at any particular point in time. So being at this particular place in this career path and branching off at this moment is the most radical and direct action that I can take for my foreseeable existence. And so it's kind of like following that spirit of one of our collective mentors, Pete Seeger, is that while he, again, sang against injustice and sang for the environment, Many of us now must do the same thing and now engage even more so. Did I hit the wrong way? I think I might have. To protect the planet. And as I mentioned, two of the biggest sinks with regards to carbon are our oceans and our forests. And that 24% globally of land sinks. And like I said, this is where I put my career, my life in right now, and trying to get us to act urgently on climate, but more than act, but be taking my knowledge, skills, and expertise to build the various relationships and points of collaboration that allows us to build upon, uh, 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 um, as I say, the best practices so that we can absolutely work on decarbonizing our planet. So at 6 million acres, you get the benefit and the joy and the peace and the serenity of, as they would say, protecting a wilderness ecosystem. But as an environmentalist and as a person who's descendant from First Nations, and my family has a particular unique history in that my ancestors were enslaved people that actually worked on a ecotourist plantation, I would call it then, but then it was called Caesar's Head. Now it's a state park in South Carolina. But they were the actual field guides that would take naturalists in the mid 1840s out into wilderness. And so me coming full circle to this place in this space of saving the planet, but now calling up on the ancient skills that my ancestors once had and hopefully tapping into them, but also that swan song of knowing that nature is going to be the last voice and the last frontier by which we can try to save humanity. But more importantly, being a place in green space by which we can build that intersectional relationship and connection of people, land, and nature, not only just within the United States, but in Brazil, Africa, Asia. They are turning to frontline nations, as they say, as the lungs to try to save us. Right now, you hear a lot of concern about the Amazon rainforest or the forest in West Africa, but the frontline nations are not the only ones that have this burden. Places like the United States and Europe should also do it. And again, it's not only for us in the actions right now, it's me passing this on to the youth in our state, within my family. It's my shameless plug to my daughter there. But right now, I'm working with youth from the metropolitan New York City. We created something called the Timbuktu Summer Climate Career, which is our equivalent of the Civilian Climate Corps, taking youth from the urban city and bringing them into the wilderness so that they would have not only an expanded portfolio by which they can engage in climate activism, but also see the role of nature and also look at careers in the sciences that protect nature and wilderness ecosystems so that they can be vibrant assets when we talk about the effects of anthropogenic climate change. And it's not that, again, as mentioned, we talked about the years, but my stewardship and actions, with going from the headwaters of the Hudson River down to the harbor. The headwaters is Lake Cloud in the Adirondacks, but down to the harbor. And organizations such as the Adirondack Council, but also Sloop Clearwater, Sierra Club, we have long been in this battle. Believe it or not, this photo is probably about 20 years old.
Aaron, I need to interrupt for just a second. We're not
Sure.
seeing your slides shared.
Oh, we're not? Oh, my goodness.
Yep. So please share.
Oh. Oh, my goodness.
There we go.
Oh, I'm sitting here rambling, and I'm thinking that you're seeing all this stuff. So forgive me. My daughters would say boomer, which is those of us the boomer generation handling technology and etc. But this was the slide I was talking about Dr. King and John Muir, and I was talking a little bit about real quickly my career as the Forever Adirondacks Wilderness Campaign Director, and the wonderful work that we deal with the wilderness carbon sink. When I was talking about ocean and land absorption of carbon, this is what I was referencing when we talk about emission sources and natural sinks. The emission sources are not coming mainly from nature; it's mostly from human-made activity, as we can see over here on the left. And we rely upon our planet to be the garbage dump, to clean up the effects of our human and our man-made activity. So I was talking about wilderness carbon sinks. what we're pumping into the atmosphere and what's taking it out. And the two big things, are basically our oceans and our lands. The rest, 59% or about 60% remains in the atmosphere. And this is something to keep when we talk about the greenhouse gases that as a result of heating that stay in. And so one of the things, by the way, real quick, that's, from the emissions side, that these are what I call the independent variables. I mean, they're dependent upon our activity, but they really drive the action. But the other greenhouse gas that's not here because it's depending upon the heating of the planet is people don't realize water vapor is a greenhouse gas. As the planet heats up, more water vapor, which is a dependent gas upon the other greenhouse gases. As the planet heats up, you get more water vapor, which again traps more heat. If you've ever been, it's called the sauna effect. So when you think about that, that's another powerful gas that's dependent upon. So you get a sense of effect. Now I was talking about the 6 million acres of the Adirondacks being the lungs of America. This is my current front office rather than the Corning Tower in the New York State Department of Health. And this is a much better and beautiful view and a little bit more heart healthy. And I was talking about intergenerational, intersectional, and I mentioned my daughter. It's my youngest of my four. And going forward again from the headwaters to the harbor. And again, like I said, this is old film, this old picture from about 20 years old. And this is Clearwater, Adirondack Council, Sierra Club, other environmental activists. And I believe that's Manna Joe down there with G.E. Jeffrey there. But the point of the matter is we are not Johnny-come-latelys to this fight. We have long, passionately fought on many fronts and many dynamics against corporate polluters, but those who are driving the degradation of our planet and creating a lot of the harms. And so people talk about, climate is the big thing we need to focus on. But my point in this particular side is that even though I'm fighting the bulk of my professional life right now in climate, we must still sweat the small stuff. We must still sweat all the other effects and the impacts that humanity is having on the environment, whether it's the PCB still left behind in the Hudson, the radioactive contamination still at Indian Point, all the other things, everything matters. And so you don't get to put something on the back burner. These are just like what we normally dynamically deal with in life. It's like an emergency room at the hospital. You got your big trauma cases and you got your other cases. And so you got to manage them all. The issue is about management, but that's why we must grow and build this particular movement. And yes, I talked about a civilian climate corps and mentoring. It's also about replicating. And the other critical thing, we talk about hospital finance and managing that emergency room. That's why your donations are essential to organizations like the Clearwater and the Adirondack Council. We're not for free. I mean, we're not for profit, but it doesn't mean we're not for free because it costs the money and the resources for us to engage and apply our expertise and our skill. Corporations pay fortunes and they make fortunes to, as I say, that vicious cycle of profit and degradation. Here we try to heal, but we make no profit on trying to heal the planet from the work that we try to do. And our work is often what really matters. Because right now we're witnessing in past 2023, this is just 2023 climate impacts. We have been now, as I say, 2023 was the year that really serious climate disruption, which will be our new normal. And things will just only it's going to be peaks and troughs of as things get worse. So it's sort of like the climate hockey stick, but the same thing is happening with weather, meaning that we're breaking records every year. And so when you put that water vapor up, as the planet increases, more moisture in the atmosphere, and the storm events are that much more severe. We're right now, if you turn on your news tonight or later tonight, you'll notice that there's a rain bomb going off in California again. And the results are devastating. These are the 700-year floods, the 1,000-year floods that are not occurring 700 years or 1,000 years. They're right now coming semi-annually. And the question with regards to climate disruption and climate crisis is how often and the frequency. And the cost of what corporations call that are creating this crisis and externality are borne by the taxpayers. We are paying for it coming and going. And this is why we cannot passively lay down. When I talk about, you know, the rain bombs, what's causing these rain bombs? What's causing these weird peaks and, as I say, disruptive patterns? Just right up to the 80s, we had a quasi-stable, you know, mid 90s, right? About up to Paris, we still had a quasi-stable polar vortex. And the polar vortices, there's the North Polar vortices and the Southern Polar vortex. So these vortices are what basically are like these upper high-speed cyclones that pretty locked in the Arctic. And this is what allowed the Arctic and Antarctic to expand and contract within that vortex. What, you know, you would know that we talk about the thickening of the ice and the snow. But in short, this was, you know, as I say, up until Paris, this was pretty much a fairly stable pattern. But since Paris, since we have not really moved aggressively enough on acting on climate and reducing carbon, since we had not reduced and began to aggressively draw down the emission of carbon dioxide, the planet has warmed, and as the planet has warmed, it has destabilized the polar vortex. And this is what we're seeing right now with the weird peaks and troughs and dips. Now, a lot of people are looking at these things, these flows, and looking at localized weather events and seeing that perhaps a particular trough of the polar vortex dipping all cold all the way down to Texas and the localized weather event, they're conflating that disruption, the fact that that's cold, that the planet is not warming. This is pure nonsense. And unfortunately, for us, a lot of people at critical political decision levels are right now have stalled action since Paris on our nation's action, not only just within our country, but again, around the globe. And this is part of the conversation I'll get into about how corporations impact our democracy that lead to inaction, but it's inaction that delayed, as I say, that delay has cost us this level of current destabilization that we're witnessing right now. And global warming, as we move on and this destabilization intensifies, this becomes the new normal or the new foundation or the new floor that we as a people, as a species, have to deal with. And when we talk about the impacts, you know, we're talking about this is last year's January temperatures. This year's January temperatures are pretty much on time. Again, unusual warm. If you notice today, this past winter, we've only had 3 snow events in Albany. This is the warmest January in Albany. And again, for a lot of us old geezers, this is, you know, it may feel a little bit comfortable, but if you're a true Northeasterner and you know that we would have at least 4 to 5 feet of snow by now. And we kicked off January of last year in the Adirondacks with one of the lowest snows that we've ever had in the Adirondacks. And they had something called the FISU Winter Games, which was a attempt to emulate the Winter Games in Lake Placid, but with the emphasis on climate. We had a climate conference as part of that, so that people know that there's whole industries, in this case, whole sports, that will almost disappear because we will no longer have the venues that we've enjoyed for winter sports. But again, this is a direct result of heat within the atmosphere, what people may think from one cold day to another, which is the weather, that therefore that proves that that's not the case. The answer at the end of the day is that pay attention to the science. And the science is very basic, it's very clear, it's very powerful, is that we are warming. And again, we are right now approaching that critical threshold of 2 degrees Celsius. And with that comes, you know, the huge spectrum of climate risk and extreme weather events. And these events is sort of like the boiling frog in the pot. They will come over time and they will feel gradual, and they give us the mistaken comfort that we actually have time to act, and act in a very slow manner. And rather than as urgent as the call went out in Paris, which went in 2015, the fossil fuel sector, just like the tobacco sector, when we sued our state government. I was part of the tobacco. By the way, I was one of the state experts in testifying on behalf of the New York State that led us to help us win that tobacco settlement. And and we're witnessing that same type of fight. Corporations do not lie down. To have them cease burning fossil fuels, we're talking about trillions of dollars in stranded assets, and they are fighting like the devil. And they're doing everything in their power, and they have significant power to affect our democracy, to affect who gets elected, to control the presidency, because now they're thinking 2 years for Congress, 4 years, 6 years for the Senate, 4 years for the presidency, and then you got state level apparatuses. They have rolled out a full-scale onslaught to slow any action, just like the tobacco industry, on damaging their financial bottom line. But here's the answer. Here's the risk, is that the bottom line for them and preserving their behavior is the real serious cost is going to be to us, the general population. Because at the end of the day, when we talk about the extreme weather events, these entities have actually also crippled our government's investments to actually deal and mitigate with these disasters and disaster relief. You hear the debates with regards to disaster relief. So where are we? It takes a little bit. You just don't want to jump into COP28 because you got to talk about the background and why the urgency of COP28 and why the significance of what I'm going to say about COP28 when I put it into context of where it happened and what happened there. Okay. One of the things that you see right now is that this is the trend line that we are currently on. That's that line in red. And the green, the blue basically is if we were like really went out at the Paris and really went aggressively going at the carbon and reducing carbon, getting off of fossil fuels. And this is where we're not at. Okay. And right now we're trying to push with regards to climate action for us to try to still push toward that 1.5 degree to 2 degrees Celsius. And that requires us to radically eliminate the use of fossil fuels. And that was one of the critical themes that at Paris, this is the path that we're supposed to decarbon. And we talk about decarbonization. That means ending the use of fossil fuels. And again, and transitioning to clean energy and clean fuels and clean, technologies. So the great thing about COP since Paris, we now have the capacity to do a lot of this. We are now at a place where the transition costs and the factors that allow us to move now is dependent upon political will and serious intergovernmental action. And basically major states like the United States, England, Europe, leading the charge. Now, a lot of people get caught up into, well, what about India? What about China? The answer at the end of the day is that, it's the actions of global markets, the action of global leaders that ratchet up the action of those who don't want to conform. We can, just as we saw with the current trade war with China, there are incentives and ways that we can always bring outside actors. But the reason why our fossil fuel sector is raising the straw man, well, what about this guy, what we call whataboutism, is to facilitate another year of delay, to facilitate another year of dragging out the argument. And so we are not at all trending where we should be trending. This is right now, you hear the arguments of, well, we scaled up, we've tripled the amount of production of clean technology and all these other things. But we also right now, due to the fossil fuel sector, increased the subsidies for fossil fuel and burning more carbon. But equally, more importantly, we've actually become the largest driller of oil. America right now is the #1 producer of carbon fossil fuels, in the globe. This is the insanity that we're on one end looking at the left hand is doing, and the right hand is off doing the same old thing. So the end result is what's that net? People talk, well, we got carbon capture technology that the fossil fuel sectors are scaling up. Yes, they're scaling up carbon capture technology, which, by the way, is not working. It's junk science. It's already been out there proven. But it's only at the point of production. What they don't leave in that equation is that with that carbon capture technology enabling the more drilling for more oil, more fossil fuels, they're not factoring in what happens when you burn the fossil fuels that they just drilled. So on one level, with that increased volume of us now being number one fossil fuel producer, is you now need to factor that into our NDCs, what happens when you burn that fossil fuels. And that's the thing that is really, really dangerous, because when we talk about what is because information objects, as a public health professional, I love information objects because they help people break down that complex numbers and those lines and trends. So what does that mean? What happens, if we don't obtain that 1.5 degree Celsius, okay? So here's that 1.5 degrees Celsius, okay? It's right, that's the color right about here, right? And so if we don't achieve that and we get stuck at the 2 degrees Celsius, remember, I mentioned that 2 degrees Celsius, that's when our cryosphere, that's the polar regions and the ice regions and the cooler regions of the country, of the globe, start to get the thaw point. And remember, it's global warming. So it's the whole planet at 2 degrees Celsius. And ice is not freezing at 2 degrees Celsius. We begin the long thaw. Just like, remember, there was a glacial, the ice age here in America. There's the big thaw, all right? We begin that long, big thaw. And this is where we are, okay? This is at 2020. Okay, you can look at the age, just actuarially looking at how many generations we have that if we hit that 2 degrees Celsius, here's what 2 degrees Celsius. Then you look at this table, okay, what happens and who is going to be where. So, if you're at 70 years old, okay, going up to 80, 90, 100, our generation is okay. And so if you're in the, what do they call it, the old economic and short and the long term, we're all dead. So if we listen to the Koch brothers of the world who are in their 80s and the Donald Trumps in the world who are going to be near 80s, listen, they will go right to their grave eating caviar and steak because it'll still be around. It's the next generation. It's my daughter. It's my grandkids' generation. This is the world that they're facing, in which they start to live in a planet that becomes uninhabitable. And at 2050, we talk about our current actions of 2030 and 2050 as if we can take these actions. The answer is, if we're locking it in at a 2 degrees Celsius, then it becomes how slow outback rate is. And then we're not even talking about what does that mean to species and flora and fauna. So what's another way of looking at what does 2 degrees Celsius look like to the world? Okay, that's, when you lose that cryosphere, okay, the world, the planet is facing, 4 months, on average, 60% more errors, of wildfire, agricultural yields, the ability of the planet to be a breadbasket to the human population globally that we now have becomes significantly impaired. You talk about inflation and food prices, a 2 degrees Celsius world will probably drive the competition for food prices and food stuff extremely high. There are fewer, as I say, opportunities for sea life and sea creatures to, as I say, to adopt to sea level temperature increases. But also at 2 degrees Celsius, we begin to lose all of our coral reefs. And God forbid, if you look at going back to that chart, if we are staying on that line, we get like to the probability of like a 3 degrees Celsius jump, and that's, if we pretty much are on one level producing all that green technology, but then still drilling like we're drilling in the West. If you're looking at a 3 degrees Celsius world, as you can see, local fish species go extinct. This is not, the people say, well, that's climate doomerism. No, this is physics. I mean, this is known math, known science. This is what the temperature you get, when we start to see these outsized numbers. So when we start to see the threats, the question is, why act? Why is this COP critical? Why is it important? Is that, we must realize that we must take action against those who are driving climate inaction. And that's why for the past 20 years, I've been aggressively working with allies around the globe and around the country and fighting for additional fossil fuel exploration. Back when fighting against the Dakota Access, Keystone XL. Again, there's two aspects of this because again, between the First Nations and frontline communities, they are at the forefront. And again, the threats to our democracy is often pitching the wealthy or the whites against the others. Okay, how many people in North Dakota and South Dakota cared about the indigenous population that are a threat for risk should the Dakota Access erupt? In fact, what's really funny was how EPA allowed for the whites to protect the aquifers and the water sources around their water supplies in the Dakotas, but literally running it through under the lakes that serve the Sioux Nation, which is at Standing Rock, which is really amazing. We talk about environmental racism and climate injustice. It's just the height of insanity in which folks felt that leveraging the political power for the few tax dollars and the financial gain, and it's those red folks that we ain't got to worry about. But again, this Standing Rock is where Sitting Bull is buried. If you know the story of Sitting Bull, it just further tears at your heart of injustice in the fight of why we need. But again, this is the power of the fossil fuel sector and lobbyists, who have provided major, robust, obstacles for us to engage in serious climate action. And we needed to engage in climate action at Paris. But, the wealthy 1% within the fossil fuel sector, like the Koch brothers, they have something in the United States and in England and around the world. They have their legacy network of media, financial, political ties, campaign contributions, revolving door politicians, and lobbying, not to mention, the countless folks who make millions of dollars in just literally blocking meaningful action and literally tying civil society into knots and stalling us with false arguments. And again, with the control, they realize, since the fall of Nixon and the rise of Fox News under Roger Ailes, if you control the message bump, it's not that people, want this to happen. It's just that we have a vulnerability that we right now see in our current society with the polarization that can be exploited by the corporations. But it's not only just our domestic politics, but it's also life-saving action on climate. And this is what the fossil fuel sector, has at its hand. And when you pass action on climate, going from the fossil fuel sector into climate, fossil fuel states. And this is what's made the past two COPs dangerous, because the COP prior to this was in Egypt, which is a failed civil society. It's not a democracy, it's a military dictatorship. And this is a crown head state. So this is a guy who is as medieval as you can think, regardless of the material trappings of wealth that you have in this state. Again, it's not a society that's allowing for robust action and debate. And the fact that the cops were held there, they had the power to use their state authority to control the robust activism from NGOs and other non-state actors to either protest and respond. The local populations in these states, whether it was Egypt last year or Dubai this year, could not, under penalty of death and jailing, could not go into the streets, just like the COP that we just held in Glasgow, COP26, where you saw the Extinction Rebellion and tens of thousands of activists in the streets of Scotland, thousands of activists in the streets of London, throughout Europe, robustly saying that, putting pressure on leaders around the world so the media could see that they must act on climate. That was forestalled in these states. And this is the power of not only of that state controlling it, but by Dubai being, as I say, the person that holds the gavel over the agenda. Think of it like the Speaker of the House. We talk about our current House of Representatives and how it's dysfunctional because we have a terrible speaker. Well, think about the global speaker for the planet in the case of a climate conference, where it's now in the hands of a person who basically does not want, he's the head of a petrol state who does not want his wealth or the assets of his state stranded, literally not pushing for robust language for decarbonization, robust language calling for a drawdown on fossil fuel production, robust language on ending dependency on coal. This state, was the prime place and not an accident with regards to the location, of where this conversation, this important global conversation, and this global action that need to be had, uh, uh, you know, happened but did fail to happen. And why is that key? Look at that sunset. I haven't seen a sunset. I saw that sunset sunrise. This is sunrise. Uh, looking east from the capital, my hotel in Dubai, and I haven't seen a sunrise look like that since late '60s and '70s when I was in New York City, or if you're from the West Coast in California. What does it look like when you don't have any emissions controls over burning fossil fuels? So Dubai being a fossil fuel state, it looks great at night with the nightlife, with all the neon lights. But throughout the day, this is what the day looks like. The haze that is at the petrol, the haze and the irony of it being at a petrol state, like I said, driving that conversation. By the way, how am I on time? I hope I'm not.
Aaron, you have about 2 or 3 more minutes, and then
Oh,
we'll
Jesus.
question.
Okay. I'm going to go on afterburners. So the petrol state, that's literally gabbling and driving the global outcome. This is like, another reasons why, they had this there, but more importantly, one of the things that we saw here, this was the largest number of fossil fuel lobbyists that ever participate in a COP. It's amazing. At Glasgow, they had as many fossil fuel lobbyists at Glasgow, Scotland 3 years ago, as they had, in the U.S. delegation. In Egypt, you had as many lobbyists as you had in the top 10 participating states. And at this last COP, we had a record number of fossil fuel lobbyists, plus the gavel being held in the hand of a fossil fuel state. And it was neither fair nor equitable. Frontline communities were pushed to the back line, and fossil fuel inaction was ramped up. And it was so notable that it literally made headlines around the globe. The fact that 2,400, at least, and that's actually the bottom number that they could document, at least 2,456 lobbyists and people work on behalf of the fossil fuels. So every petrochemical plus fossil fuel states were there driving this outcome. Remember, I told you about where we are with regards to that line and the serious need to act and act urgently. We went from 3 years ago, and with robust tens of thousands of activists in the streets, not only pushing for the finance that was promised, about 100 billion a year that was promised in Paris that is yet to materialize. They were touting their wind and saying, well, we got 30 billion this year, and we're going to have 30 billion pledged for the every year after. And that's 30 billion. Remember, it's supposed to be 100 billion for frontline communities that have to transition to decarbonize their economies, because basically that's what the finance is critical for. The first world nations must lead, but they are the ones that contributed the most carbon. To help third world and developing nations to basically deal with the decarbonization, they have to have the finance. And we don't want to put upon them destabilizing debt schemes like we did with the old colonial debt schemes that basically has destabilized Latin America and Central America and Africa. But basically us helping the global economy to get to meet a global goal to decarbonize the atmosphere. And it's helping our brothers and sisters in nations that need to act, but also preserve their economies, to do what we can do as well. And again, with the critical eye toward phasing out fossil fuels. So number one, not only did they fall way below the targets of finance, they did not end fossil fuel. And one of the things, we went from robust protests to like activists like this heroically again, anemic, but still sending a very strong, powerful message. A lot of frontline nations were there lifting it up. It's me and, I talked about civil society's last guest. I was on Sky News in Europe, again, preaching the fact that we need to take much more direct action. From you talk about the slide to show up 2 slides previous of that one activist. This was Egypt right here. And so you talk about, what you went down, and this is from COP27, and down to the 1 or 2 activists that were allowed to protest, gives you an idea of the impact of them controlling the gavel, controlling the message, but more importantly, controlling the pressure on nation states to act urgently in the face of the crisis. That's me and brother Bob Bullard, Peggy Shepard, they've been longtime pioneers in this frontline movement. Now, by the way, back in 2002, before a lot of what we call northern NGOs, which is the mainstream environmental organizations, got into this fight, believe it or not, it was American NGOs, American EJ NGOs, and the Indigenous nations in 2002 in Bali that were the first calling out for action on climate and saying that you cannot put a price on air and you can't put a price on water. These were folks who were in it at ground zero, and again, still fighting this fight. And again, we see another aspect of this climate crisis, and climate crisis is already driving and triggering mass migration. And we're solving this mass migration crisis with racism and xenophobia. We're now talking about the border being overrun rather than looking at the causes, the fact that we have destabilized the climate. Climate destabilization has begun and hit all around the globe. People are moving. People can't farm. What's our species do? We're a migratory species. And so the racism and xenophobia is the right-wing control of our media, triggering, again, a diversionary response to a crisis that's actually intimately tied to global warming and the global climate crisis and climate disruption. And the fight is always, we must always connect the data and the facts. This is me at one of the side NGO events talking about linking the facts, linking the data, but reminding people that, despite what the corporations control over this COP and despite the corporate control over our states, the most powerful, resilient asset we have is our grassroots action. Where I'm hopeful is that we must never lose that hope to fight and continue to fight, for that innovation. Probably somebody here might know who that young fella is. That fella right there is Solomon Green. And we talk about innovative solutions and innovative partnership. He's right now one of the big secretaries at HUB. We talk about innovations and networking and global network and what we can do locally and he gave a talk on the Inflation Reduction Act and how we're using HUD and that young woman, representative DOT transportation, how we can start to come together with new synergies and how we can start to invest that $1 trillion into direct action on frontline communities around our country, but also serve as models to other nations. And that woman on the right is her name is Sister Wawa in Wachaga of Tanzania. And she had a very powerful wilderness carbon sink project that she and I are planning to collaborate on. But the most critical asset is us. We are the most critical frontline climate resilient asset. And believe it or not, the most effective thing that we can do right now, if we want to talk about the most significant needle moving action on climate, is seizing and taking back our democracy. We saw how failed states have been now leveraged to accelerate the power and concentration of power and wealth for fossil fuels. And we know that they affect every part of our civil society. The Koch brothers, a major fossil fuel company, I think their big petroleum asset is Valero gasoline stations. They are paying for think tanks, institutes, right on down to news stations with regards to the message that climate change is a hoax, or we can absolutely get there, or we'll acknowledge something, but we everything's okay and everything's fine. it's sort of like the tobacco industry, when we had to do the fight for big tobacco. But in this case, well, the tobacco was, again, a marketing hoax that affected a lot of Americans. This right now is a hoax that will kill a lot of humanity. And the most critical thing that we can engage in as those who are listening here is engage this most powerful state on the globe, the #1 military big guy, but also the #1 global polluter, is to really seize our democracies. Who we elect now matters. It's more than just for the rule of law and all the other things that we know that we will benefit once we win all these other battles. But the most critical battle right now is for us to really go in the direction of Brazil and Australia, who have taken back their failing democracies. We must begin that fight here within the United States. I am hopeful because I am alliedship with many of you. I am hopeful because I sit on the board of Hudson River Sloop Clearwater. I'm hopeful because I work for the Adirondack Council. And every ounce of my final days as I walk this planet will be in service to the planet and the environment, but also action that will lead to more of us coming together to save our planet and save our humanity. Thank you very much.